Hi, I'm George Scott, a current senior at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York, studying ecology and environmental science, and I will be your host for this episode of Future Cities. For the next 40 minutes or so, we will be talking about coastal resilience in the Hudson Valley. The Hudson Valley is an approximately 7,000 square mile region that surrounds the Hudson River in New York State. The valley is home to major cities such as Albany and Troy at its northernmost point, as well as Yonkers in the southern part of the region, bordering the New York metropolitan area. The Hudson River runs primarily from north to south in the valley, before eventually emptying into the Atlantic Ocean just 30 miles south of Yonkers. The portion of the Hudson which flows through the valley is considered a tidal estuary, which means that these cities along the river generally experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. During these tides, the salt water of the Atlantic flows all the way up from New York Harbor to Troy and mixes with the fresh water of the Hudson River. Tidal estuaries are extremely productive ecosystems that sustain an abundance of biodiversity and provide many ecosystem services such as commercial fishing and recreational activities. The Hudson River Estuary is no exception. It is home to over 200 species of fish and key habitats such as marshes and mudflats. For the Hudson Valley, the estuary is an indispensable economic and ecological resource. Many of the major cities in the Hudson Valley, including Albany and Yonkers, are built directly adjacent to the Hudson River shoreline. These waterfront communities face numerous challenges in becoming more resilient and adapting to the various impacts of climate change and global warming. Among these major challenges are sea level rise and storm surge. Because of the ebb and flow of the estuary, the effects of rising seas in the Atlantic and major storms like hurricanes are felt all the way up the valley. During this podcast, I will be speaking to a geophysicist and members of 2 different local organizations in order to learn more about the research and work being done to build coastal resilience in the Hudson Valley. What can we learn from these waterfront communities and cities in the valley who are on the front lines when it comes to the impacts of climate change? We will also be taking a step back and discussing what resilience really means in the face of climate change and global warming. I first spoke with Dr. Klaus H, a geophysicist who specializes in disaster risk management, sustainable adaptation, and resilience to climate change and sea level rise. Klaus has worked at Columbia University's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory in Palisades, New York for over 50 years. Over his long and accomplished career, he has served on the Mayor's New York City panel on climate change, New York State's ClimAid project, and the post-Hurricane Sandy Rebuild and Design Research and Advisory Group, to name a few. I started off by asking Klaus how he got involved with work surrounding sustainable adaptation and resilience. Here was his response.
I was originally a solid earth geophysicist, meaning earthquakes, volcanoes, and the likes. That brought me closer to a multiple branching off more on the applied side, namely disaster risk management. And it also brought me into building codes and codes in general. And that in turn brought me together with engineers, architects, urban planners, and urban designers. As I was giving talks with that community, they always said, in the New York City area, you shouldn't focus on earthquakes. What we really probably need is someone who digs into sea level rise, storm surges, and flooding events.
So the name of this podcast series is Future Cities. And so I kind of wanted to ask, why is it really important to focus on urban resilience? Also, what are some of the unique challenges that cities face in addressing climate change?
Well, over the last 100 years, we have globally, but also locally and within the United States, undergone a major urbanization. More and more people move into cities. Why? Because farming that was very labor intensive is industrialized. It needs fewer people. where there's money to be made is typically in the service industries rather than in manufacturing. And even the manufacturing that was originally sometimes in cities or on the periphery cities has now been outsourced through globalization. Also, we don't need so many people in industrial production. It is natural with these trends in the economic development that cities become bigger and bigger in terms of the percentage of population. The other trend that is important in this context is that because in part of globalization, there's more and more concentration of cities along the coastlines. Harbors and commerce are essential, and it's easy to do that if you are close to the harbor in which things either get shipped out or are being brought in. So we have this combination of urbanization and concentration of large population centers on coasts, which, depending on the climate situation, but globally, of course, with sea level rise, and then more regionally, depending on whether you're in a hurricane alley or in a typhoon alley or whatever the local name for those tropical storms is. In New York, for instance, where nor'easter winter storms are a major contribution to flood events. They may not be as severe in the storm surge height, but they often last longer because those nor'easter storms sit around for a couple of days. A hurricane typically moves through relatively quickly. So nor'easter winter storms can, in this area here in the greater metropolitan region of New York City, sit around for many tidal cycles. So there's a good chance that they at least get one high tide, if not several of them. And that contributes then to the impact. So to answer your question, why are cities important? Well, there are more of them, they are bigger, and many of them are on coasts, and that makes them vulnerable.
Lastly, I asked Klaus, how is rising sea levels going to impact the Hudson Valley in the coming decades and centuries?
You can't give a single number. And why is that so? There are different models that different research institutions have to develop how to forecast sea level rise globally. So they all have a slightly different physics that they use to describe what they think the processes are. And then you have to put data into those models. And sometimes they don't use always exactly the same data sets. So the output for sea level rise forecast is somewhat uncertain. But there's an entirely different reason why it is uncertain, because we don't know whether our government and many other governments will follow the Paris Agreement or whether they will follow Trump's burn coal kind of policy. And that makes not so much a difference during this century, even so it makes a slight difference this century, but makes a big, big, big difference in the hundreds and multiple centuries into the future. So for this century, we practically have front-loaded the atmosphere with so much CO2, carbon dioxide, a few other greenhouse gases, that what we add right now in any given year makes more a difference for the future rather than for this century. And why? Because there's a long time constant before what's in the atmosphere gets eventually out, dissolved into the ocean, or turned by animals in the ocean into calcareous shells that then fall as sediments to the ocean floor. So that process has a very long time constant, more than 100 years, multiple 100 years. And that's why when we have front-loaded our carbon dioxide atmosphere with over the last 100 years. You can't change that rapidly unless we invent some geoengineering that has been talked about. And there are a few technologies we can briefly discuss, but not on the magnitude that we would need to geoengineer to suck essentially CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we have two uncertainties for forecast. One is the methodology, and the other is what we do with CO2. For this century, the forecasts, I was part of the NPCC, which is the New York City Panel on Climate Change, that made those forecasts for this region. And NPCC is in analogy to the IPCC that makes the global forecast. But they're often not very good locally because there are local factors that modify these global forecasts. And that's why under Mayor Bloomberg in 2008 or so, the NPCC was created and I was drafted into it. And so we worked on this. And so now we have made probabilistic forecasts. We have a 50 percentile, which means that 50% of all those different forecasts fall at or below that value, but 50% are above. Now, do you want to use a 50 percentile? Probably not if you are risk averse, because you don't want to be having a 50% chance of being wrong and therefore being flooded. So you want to take a much higher percentile. And the recommendation of the NPCC was, and it pretty much has been adopted for most applications, is to take the 90 percentile. So 90 percentile of all these different forecasts are below and only 10% are above. Now, many people say, why in the hell taking such a high value? Well, if you would fly out to San Francisco and buy an airline ticket, and the airline would tell you there's a 10% chance that this airplane will fall out of the sky, you would not buy that airline ticket. You might even wonder if 99% is good enough for you if there's a 1% chance to fall out of the sky. And the real numbers are actually less than a per mil for any given flight. So it's really safe. So we see we have different safety standards for different in life. So anyhow, for the 90 percentile of sea level rise forecasts, we will end up with 75 inches in the lower Hudson Valley, which is, after all, 6 feet and 3 inches by the end of the century. And that is relative to about the year 2000. So that's the reference. And then 6 feet above what it was in the year 2002, let's call it. That's an awful lot, because the actual storm surge of Sandy was in the order of, let's call it 6 to 8 feet, depending on where. And then you have about 3 to 4 feet of tides. And so when you add a storm surge and it happens to coincide with high tides, it comes out 10, 11 feet or something like that, 9 to 11 feet. And if you now have a 6-foot sea level rise on top of all this, and you would have a Sandy not in the year 2012, but in the year 2112, you would have to add another 6 feet on it. And that just would really create havoc. Not only that, smaller storms that are not as big as Sandy need only 2 or 3 feet on top of that sea level rise to get where Sandy was going without that sea level rise. And so you see that smaller storms are much more frequent. So not only do we get higher storm surges, we get more frequent storm surges at locations that barely were flooded in Sandy and now get flooded in the future by the year 2100 or thereabouts with small storms. So the frequency goes up, and the 1% per year flood zone moves ever farther inland and claims more and more assets.
Next, I talked with an old boss of mine, Ryan Palmer, who is director of the Sarah Lawrence College Center for the Urban River at Beczak in Yonkers, New York. Ryan has been director of the center, often referred to by its acronym CURB, since 2013, and has been working in the environmental nonprofit field for over 10 years. He is trained in land use law, stream monitoring, biodiversity assessments, watershed management, and planning. Ryan has also been a member of the board of directors for the Hudson River Watershed Alliance since 2014, which he is currently the president of. I previously worked for Ryan at CURB in 2018 and 2019, where I was a lab technician and research associate helping to process water samples as part of the Hudson River Water Quality Program. The program is just one example of the many ways that Ryan and the Center for the Urban River are involved in environmental work in the Hudson Valley. I asked him a few questions to learn more. First off, could you tell me a little bit about the Center for the Urban River at Beczak, and how and why the center was founded?
Sure. So CURB is a part of Sarah Lawrence College. We're founded in 2013. We're an education and research center and field station of the college located right on the banks of the Hudson River in downtown Yonkers, New York. So our mission in the broadest sense is to advance environmental knowledge and stewardship about the Hudson River and urban watersheds. And we do that through education, research, and community programming. So on the education side, we serve people of all ages. Annually, we educate thousands, like 4,000 to 5,000 K through 12 students a year, dozens of Sarah Lawrence College students. We work with faculty there, and many, many community scientist volunteers. On the research side, we're currently focused on long-term monitoring of the Hudson River and urban watersheds, primarily the Sawmill River, which is our home river in Yonkers. The monitoring is focused on water quality and biodiversity, and we have a particular interest in tracking sewage pollution, which unfortunately is a big problem locally. And for our community programming, we host a variety of events for the community throughout the year. At least in a normal pre-COVID year, we would be doing that. But those range from lectures, conferences, big community barbecues, musical performances, and really everything in between. So we're really kind of an active, vibrant community center as well.
In terms of programs and actions surrounding coastal resilience in the Hudson Valley, what sort of things is CURB involved with or has been involved with in the past?
Sure. So we've primarily been involved through education. Talking about coastal resiliency comes naturally with all of our education programs, which makes sense considering our site right on the river, surrounded by an urban center of Yonkers. So if you can imagine standing, at the water's edge, the Hudson River's edge, on our 2-acre park site, we have a nice restored tidal marsh, a sailing beach, and then if you were to look all around you, you'd see these big high-rise condo buildings. So it really just lends itself to resiliency. It's right there in your face, so it's always incorporated into our education programs. At the waterfront, we also have sea level rise and storm surge sign. It depicts sea level rise up to the year 2100, showing different scenarios of severity of sea level rise. It also marks the storm surge height from Hurricane Sandy, which was at our site about 6 feet above high tide. So you can imagine, again, standing there at our waterfront, with looking at that sign. For most people, that storm surge height is above head level, and just that reality that if you were there during Sandy, you'd be underwater. So that sign gets a lot of attention from park visitors, and I think kind of makes it real for them. So that sign is from a project we completed a few years ago, where we created a special high school level coastal resiliency curriculum. That was in partnership with Groundwork Hudson Valley with funding from NOAA. And we offer that program now as part of our regular field trip options. It's a great program, great grant. That grant also funded an accurate model of the lower Hudson River estuary that we have. It's actually waterproof, so we can use it to demonstrate sea level rise and storm surge. We use that quite a bit in a lot of our lessons. It's a great teaching tool. And then beyond education, we've also been active participants in many local and regional discussions about climate change, coastal resiliency. We serve on the Yonkers Green State Advisory Committee, the New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary Program Citizens Advisory Committee. We advise the state DEC on some of their programming, and co-chair the Water Committee of the Westchester Climate Crisis Task Force, so just to name a few. So we're really active in a lot of discussions, sometimes providing leadership, sometimes just being there, to provide input both as scientists and waterfront stakeholders.
So circling back to this question of education, because CURB plays such a major role, what do you think is the role and importance of education in addressing coastal resilience, and how does CURB approach its education programs surrounding climate change?
Education is everything, period. It really is, especially with young people, the next generation of leaders. These issues we're talking about, climate change, they're not short-term issues. They're not going to be solved anytime soon. So we really need those young people to step up. To be completely honest, sometimes I feel like the older generation is almost a lost cause at this point, and this should be focusing all our energy, on young people. But yeah, so getting young people at least educated on the science, I think is, step one. It's critical. If somehow you could bridge that gap and actually get them to care, that's key, right? And then they'll carry that with them their whole lives and in their actions. So that's why at CURB, the approach we take, it's always been a place-based approach to our programs. So always root whatever we're teaching about, whether it's climate change or whatever, to Yonkers, to the community at large. I mean, it's a useful method for all topics, but especially for climate change, which is a big issue. It's a global issue. It can be hard for people to connect with it personally. Not everybody is going to be, called to action by hearing about sea ice and polar bears. But if you can bring it down to their level, bring it down locally to Yonkers, I think that's your best chance of connecting with people.
So I know that besides being the director at CURB, you are also the president of the Hudson Valley Watershed Alliance. Could you talk a little bit about the goals and the mission of this alliance and how it came to be?
Sure. So the Hudson River Watershed Alliance got started around 2003. I actually go back to the beginning. At the time, the Alliance was not an independent nonprofit, but it was housed through Clearwater, where I was working at the time. So I actually ended up being the first coordinator of the Alliance, going way back when. But the Alliance started very much organically. It really had to do with what was going on around that time in the Hudson Valley. So the area was experienced a huge development boom around that time. Remember, this was like late 90s, early 2000s. So the 90s economy was booming. This was way before the 2008 recession, right? So housing going up everywhere. And people honestly started to notice the impact on their local streams, just from things not being enforced or development going rampant. And there was very, very few local groups kind of solely focused on protecting water, which we refer to now, we call them watershed groups. Plenty of other, local community groups focused on this, that, the other thing, but not specifically to water. At the same time, in terms of the larger environmental community, for decades, the focus has been on the Hudson River for these big groups, right? And for good cause. I mean, there's lots of things going on with the river. PCBs were still a big issue back then. The big decision from EPA to make GE clean up PCBs didn't come until 2002, for instance, so like right around that same time. So that really took the attention of a lot of the big environmental groups. So again, you have all these things going on, and sort of one by one, watershed groups started emerging because of those issues. Then they started getting some support. I'll give credit to the DEC Estuary program, because they saw these groups emerging and really started investing in them with grants and training. And because of that, you started seeing more and more pop up. And that's why I was saying how the Alliance came about organically. I think before too long, a lot of these groups realized having some sort of alliance to unite them, provide some kind of common mission and voice, provide education through workshops and conferences, and really just a forum for the groups to interact and learn from each other was critical. And that's where the Alliance came from. So their mission to this day still reflects those needs. The mission to unite and empower communities to protect their local water resources. Our main focus is still supporting those local watershed groups, but we also work closely with municipalities of all levels, town, county, state. A big goal, eventually would be for every, local watershed to have some sort of local watershed protection group. Right. I think it's probably around like 30 now. But yeah, that's, the mission, it's interesting, is very closely related to CURB, in that, it's ultimately linked to the belief that, well, not a belief, of the fact, right, that engaged and educated people are the most effective tool to bring about change, right? So it's all about educating people, getting people active. That's more powerful than any kind of top-down regulation, at least in my opinion.
You could maybe highlight any substantial policy projects that CURB or the Hudson River Watershed Alliance has been a part of recently.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually one big issue I wanted to highlight here that CURB's been working on from different angles for a number of years now. So it all has to do with how wastewater is conveyed through Westchester and treated in Yonkers. So just for some background, the Yonkers Joint Wastewater Treatment Plant, massive plant. It's located in southwest Yonkers, right on the river, and basically at sea level. Right, so it treats sewage from about 63% of Westchester's population. So we're talking over 500,000 people. And that wastewater is conveyed through a really complex system of pipes over dozens and dozens of miles through Westchester, right? A lot of it along the Sawmill River before it gets to Yonkers. And it should definitely point out that most of that wastewater is coming from very affluent, very white suburban towns in Westchester, ending up in Yonkers, which is not very white and not very affluent. And in particular, the neighborhoods where the treatment plant and the pump station are located are some of the poorest neighborhoods in Yonkers. So this is a textbook environmental justice issue, really just horrendous. But obviously the system was built a long time ago before environmental justice really existed. So we're left to deal with it at this point. But those problems are going to get even worse with climate change. Now, I mentioned before the plant is basically at sea level, right? It's right on the river. During Sandy, it was completely shut down for 14 hours during the height of the storm. 50 million gallons of completely untreated sewage into the river just in those 14 hours. Then it took 4 weeks for them to get totally up and running again. So at that point, over those 4 weeks, 1.2 billion with a B gallons out into the river that was partially treated with chlorine, but still not actually treated sewage. So that's obviously not sustainable. And then on top of that, the whole system routinely has combined sewer overflows to the Hudson from rain. It doesn't take a whole lot of rain. And this happens quite often throughout the year, for anywhere from like 1 to 3 million gallons of sewage at a time, of combined sewer overflow, I should say, not straight sewage, go out into the river. Obviously, that is not going to get any better with climate change. If everything's accurate, that will get more rain, more intense storms. That problem is just going to keep getting worse. And again, a lot of that stormwater is not from Yonkers. A lot of it is getting into these pipes from upstream, from the affluent communities, even though it's supposed to be a combined system. But that paints the picture of just how unsustainable this system is. It's going to be a huge undertaking to actually fix this stuff. But like I said, we've been working on this for a number of years, number of angles. One of the main things is just through our community science program. We're out there testing for a better part of the year, every year, testing the sawmill, testing the Hudson, continually finding really high levels of fecal bacteria indicators, and we share those data with everybody who will listen. So, part of that monitoring is education. Part of it is essentially just letting decision makers know that we're watching, that the problem is not going away. Sometimes that's as much as you need to do to get people's attention. We've held some big conferences. We had a big one at PACE in 2018, lots of local officials. We work with coalitions. We have the Lower Hudson Partnership we help lead with Riverkeeper and Bronx River Alliance. So like I said, it's a combination of research, education, community, right? Our mission. The only good news I guess I have on this topic is that the county has just started a big policy initiative to at least get county ownership of all that big network of pipes I mentioned. Right now, the county owns some of them, and then every other municipality in Westchester County owns another portion of them. And it just gets very complicated, and it's just really, at the end of the day, it makes it very hard for things to get fixed, for pipes to get fixed, for leaks to get fixed. So right now, the county is starting an effort to try to take over control of all the entire system, which again is going to be a baby step. It won't fix anything immediately, but at least when conversations start happening about what to do in the future with sea level rise and that giant treatment plant, there'll at least be one entity in charge of the whole system. So it might seem like a small win, but I said our coalition of partners is really excited that things are at least moving forward in Westchester County.
Lastly, I spoke with Jessica Kuonen, who is the Hudson Estuary Resilience Specialist at New York Sea Grant. Jessica works from Kingston, New York in the Hudson Valley and specializes in watershed and land use planning and policy in response to climate change impacts and extreme weather. She serves a variety of stakeholder groups as part of New York Sea Grant that include coastal communities, coastal businesses, and public and private landowners in the Hudson Valley. Here is what we talked about. What are some ways that the Hudson Valley area is impacted by climate change?
So when it comes to climate projections for the Hudson Valley, we kind of have these three main projections and then all these cascading impacts. So one is increasing temperatures. So this can look like heat waves, which is not good for human health and is more of an issue in cities. If you think about it, if more people are running air conditioning, that leads to higher utility costs. It can tax the electrical grid, which leads to power outages. And increasing temperatures and heat waves can impact our food systems, if crops fail. And it also impacts the ecology. So all these plant and animal communities that, the Hudson, this environment is how they've, where they thrive. And since the environment is changing, they're stressed, they're shifting where they live, and that can lead to more of a chance for things like invasive species and pests to come in. The second big one is changes in precipitation patterns. So that means more erratic, more frequent and intense rain events with periods of drought in between. So yesterday was a really good example. It rained, hard and heavy all day long. I'm sure you experienced it. And I was on Facebook in the evening, and a lot of people were reporting things like having flooded basements, flooded roads, emergency services were out helping people. And just all this extra water leads to flooding based on the way that we've altered the landscape. Another factor in this is water quality. There's pollutants, there's nitrogen and runoff that can impact water quality and lead to harmful algal blooms and impact our drinking water supplies. And then the third major projection is rising sea level, because we are in an estuary. So over the past century, sea level has risen about a foot in the Hudson Valley, and it is currently accelerating. And by the end of the century, it could rise as much as 6 feet. A lot of our waterfront communities are already experiencing extra high tides every now and then. It often happens during the full and the new moon. And we call this nuisance flooding, sunny day flooding, where roads, homes, and businesses along the waterfront can get flooded during a tidal cycle. When you have higher water levels and you have boat traffic, it's more energy hitting the shoreline, and that can cause erosion. So this slowly starts to eat away at the land along the river. And then finally, we have a lot of infrastructure down by the water. So things like our wastewater treatment plants, we have our train tracks, which are really vital for the Hudson Valley. They're all located right there by the river. So all of these things together translate into a lot of money in the short term, money in the long term that we have to spend. And these are all kind of unfolding over time. And then, of course, I have to mention the extreme events, which are our storms of record were tropical storms Lee and Irene, which happened in 2011, and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And Lee and Irene, the main thing was precipitation. So there was all this rainfall that caused catastrophic flooding high up in the valley all the way down to the river. And then Hurricane Sandy, it was less about rainfall and more about the storm surge that came up from the ocean. So those two events back to back, 3 events actually, were kind of wake up calls and gave us kind of like a glimpse into what we're going to be experiencing more in the future.
Could you tell me a little bit about how you got involved with New York Sea Grant and what the mission of the program is? Because I know it's doing a lot of really important work right now.
Sea Grant is a national program. We have a state program in every coastal and Great Lakes state, and it is a federal university partnership between NOAA and the land-grant university in each state. Sometimes it's a few universities. And the general mission is to help citizens better understand, conserve, and utilize America's coastal resources. And so what that means is, for my position, which is extension specialist, is really to be that bridge between the latest academic research and what coastal communities really need and are experiencing. And so that goes 2 ways. We make sure communities are informed, but also that researchers are informed about what is actually needed, because, those 2 things don't always align. And my focus in the Hudson is resilience, but I have colleagues on Long Island and in the Great Lakes that focus on things like seafood, aquaculture. But in New York, at New York Sea Grant, our tagline is bringing science to the shore. And we're about to have our 50th anniversary.
What have been some of the challenges of addressing coastal resilience issues in the Hudson Valley?
Yeah, so we have some big challenges. For one, New York is a home rule state. And broadly, what that means is that the state can't enact any type of comprehensive floodplain management policy that everyone has to follow. Every community has to do it individually. And so there's some pros and some cons to that, but it's definitely a con when it comes to trying to have comprehensive climate adaptation planning. So a lot of the things that the partners in the region tend to do are help communities, update their comprehensive plans. This is a process that includes a lot of public engagement, helping communities update their zoning, run vulnerability and risk assessments, but all this stuff really takes years. So it requires a lot of technical assistance. Kind of related to that is, I mentioned before that we have a lot of small communities along the river. So, sometimes the population is like, 2,000, 10,000 people for some of these waterfront communities. And therefore they have issues with what we call capacity. And that just means that even if they wanted to do any of these planning processes, they don't always have the money or the people power, to carry it out. And even if they had people that wanted to carry it out, they might just not have time. So one way we try to tackle that is the Hudson River Estuary Program provides grants, and Cornell Cooperative Extension provides a lot of technical assistance to try to help add extra hands, extra people power to these communities so that they can do this planning. I think another challenge is general awareness and getting buy-in from the communities. A lot of the places that have made progress have had some real champions, some real individuals that have been able to take this work and make it happen and carry it forward. So there's definitely just getting it on people's minds front and center that this is something that needs to be planned for is always a problem, I think. And especially because you don't get immediate payoffs from it, right? That's always the problem with trying to prevent something from happening. And then I'll also just say that in the Hudson Valley, we have these steep slopes. We don't have a lot of land. We don't have a lot of places that people can actually move to. And we especially are having some issues with affordable and low-income housing.
What are some of the specific ways that the Sea Grant spreads awareness around issues of coastal resilience?
Yeah, so in general, for New York Sea Grant, we have extension specialists like me throughout the state that stay informed on the issues. And so, our role is really to connect people with resources based on whatever questions they have. So we have a website with resources, and we have a pretty active social media account that people can plug into if they want to. I also have a couple of projects going on in the Hudson to help raise awareness. One of them is establishing a community flood reporting tool. And this is where, if we were having a nuisance flooding one day, an extra high tide, or maybe after a storm, people could go out, take pictures of it, and then upload it to a website. And that way we can start to build a database that's actually documenting these impacts that can help spread awareness, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. I also have a project that's developing some educational resources online that just kind of give that broad view of what is happening in the Hudson Valley in a way that's simple, easy to understand, and really speaks to the issues that matter to people. We provide all this technical assistance, but I don't know if there's one resource we can point to for anyone that just wants the quick 5-minute skim. They can skim something and then learn oh, this is what's happening here. So I have a project in the works to develop something like that within the next year. And then real quick, I also have a project I wanted to talk about, which is I worked with a colleague in Buffalo, Monica Miles, and we created an environmental justice mapping tools guide. And this kind of gets at some of that interdisciplinary justice-oriented ways of approaching problems. And the way that came about is we started exploring how to use free online mapping tools to teach environmental justice, just because maps are a powerful way to visualize data. And we ended up making this guide that brings together 22 different free mapping tools, talks a little bit about how to use them, just because this information is out there, but people don't always know about it. And so my hope is that it will be used by community-based organizations and local officials to access data that can help them plan. And the data includes environmental stuff, demographic data, a little bit on health and housing, and climate projections. So trying to bring that all together for people.
It's clear that there is a lot of work and research being done to make the Hudson Valley more resilient. But what does resilience really mean? I asked both Klaus and Jessica to unpack the term and give their own definitions. Here's what they each said.
Resilience, in my mind, is that you look ahead rather than react. Of course, it's not easy for everybody just to look ahead and then don't have the resources to do anything about it. So resilience, just like disasters, depends very much on pre-existing social conditions. There are more vulnerable communities and less vulnerable communities. So if you pair that backdrop with the hazards exposure, whatever the hazard is, then the resilience takes on quite a different appearance, because very vulnerable people, socially vulnerable, poorer people, or those that have been sidelined by cultural, political, social prejudices, have much harder to be as resilient as more affluent and privileged society members, given the same hazard exposure. They will have most likely different resilience. So the social aspect in resilience is a very important one. The hazards exposure is more important in the sense there is often a historic knowledge how to respond to things, which contributes to resilience, hopefully. Where there is greater hazard, there is a likelihood that there is experience around, and therefore that contributes to the resilience.
Resilience is, a word that obviously means a lot of different things to a lot of different people in a lot of different contexts. But for this one, first I'm going to read off a definition that's like a pretty good one that we use at New York Sea Grant, which is: resilience is a community's ability to anticipate, prepare for, withstand, and recover from extreme weather events such as storms, flooding, and drought. Resilient communities are better able to sustain vital services, healthy ecosystems, and economic vitality. So that's a pretty good definition because it covers, the human, the environment, the economy, all those different systems. But, resilience, my own personal definition, it's kind of the ability to accept and embrace change. It requires kind of like an openness to doing things differently, being flexible and being comfortable with uncertainty. And another aspect of it, I think, is the ability to kind of center relationships. So relationships with the people you're working with your neighbors, with the environment, just because that kind of forces you to think more holistically and to take more of like a systems view.
Klaus, Ryan, and Jessica all pointed to some similar things during our interviews. They discussed how the Hudson Valley and its coasts face increasing temperatures, changes in precipitation, rising sea levels, and potentially catastrophic storm surge. We also learned that all of these issues are going to impact crucial infrastructure in the valley, such as transportation systems and sewage treatment plants. Overall, it seems that there is a real need for comprehensive planning and spreading awareness about the impacts of climate change and global warming in local communities. The best way to do this seems to be a combination of education, technical assistance, increased funding, and collaboration among experts and community members. In Jessica's words, the more that we can accept and embrace change, the better. This has been an exploration into coastal resilience in the Hudson Valley. Thank you for listening.
The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.